Near the end of the aughts, in Munich, Germany, students had gathered from across the country to attend Media Design University, one of the few schools that offered courses on game design. During a class, a small group of students started working on a mobile game as a part of their coursework. But that was only the first of many projects to come. One member of this group was Dominic Abe. He was a big fan of stealth-based, real-time tactics games, like Pyro Studios' Commandos and Spellbound Entertainment's Desperados: Wanted Dead or Alive. Unfortunately, that type of game appeared to have fallen out of fashion, and he wondered what happened to games in the genre. While he did love those games, there was something that he wanted to change. One day, he was walking down a hallway with another member of the group, Moritz Wagner. During the course of their conversation, he had an interesting thought. If they ever got the chance to make a game like that, if they were given the opportunity to revive the real-time tactics genre, he would want to make a game just like Commandos, but with ninjas. While working on one of their projects, the group started joking around about things not exactly working how they wanted them to. As a way of expressing their complaints and frustrations, while also poking fun at themselves, they decided to name their project Mimimi, the sound of someone crying. But the name stuck, and they chose to keep it after deciding to make games together in October of 2008. In 2009, they started working on their first game as Mimimi Productions, Grounded. Johannes Roth, the game's producer and head programmer, described the game as a modern 2D platformer that combines classic gameplay with a landscape that can be changed in real time. Grounded was produced as a part of their coursework, and there were 10 students who worked on the project. Their goal was to win a German Developer Award, and after it was released in November of that year, that goal was met, taking home second place in the GamesLoad Newcomer Awards. They got the idea for their next game, Da Vinci, at some point in 2009. Unlike Grounded, this would be a commercial product instead of a school project. The goal of the game was to use the weather to guide a hot air balloon safely to its destination. After just finishing work on a 2D game, they decided to try working with a 3D engine in Unity. The game was primarily developed by 4 people from Mimimi Productions, alongside 3 outside contributors, one of them being Filippo Beck-Pacos, a freelance game audio designer who was responsible for the game's music and sound effects. They took it to Gamescom in 2010, and generally, the game was received very well. However, there was one thing that stuck out: the controls. Using a mouse just didn't feel right, and several people suggested that they switch to touch controls. After hearing all this, they considered developing the game for iOS devices, but in order to do that, they would need around 15,000 euros worth of additional hardware and software, which wasn't something that they could afford. Fortunately for the team, Reality Twist, a game publisher based in Munich, was so impressed with the prototype that they decided to publish the game and provide them with all the equipment that they needed. In order to ensure that the game was profitable, they decided to keep the size of the team small, but they also had to make some changes. They decided to bring on 2 people to rework the game's art style: Florian Smolka, a visual effects artist, and Lucas Rainier, a concept artist. While this was a commercial project, they were all still students, so development would be done alongside their coursework. But despite this initial success and the potential of Da Vinci, they weren't convinced that they should establish a game studio. Like most students, they were planning to go their separate ways after graduation. They also didn't want to fall into the same trap as many other young development teams right out of school, failing shortly after founding a studio. But they did want to try something a bit more ambitious, a larger project that they could use to gather experience and have something to put on their resumes. If they could create a good 3D action-adventure prototype, it would be an impressive addition to their portfolios. 2011 would be a big year for Mimimi Productions. In January, Mimimi Productions was officially established as a GPR, which is the simplest and easiest to establish business structure in Germany. This wasn't because they changed their minds about founding a studio, but because they needed to be able to sign contracts. In February, they started working on an action-adventure prototype that they called Tink, and it was completed in 25 days. They followed this up with the release of their first commercial project when Da Vinci was released on the App Store on April 14, 2011. While the game was received well by critics, it even received an Apple Design Award in the student category in 2012. It didn't sell particularly well. In June, the team once again considered founding their own studio. However, since they wanted to be able to pay everyone enough money for them to live on their own, they didn't have any way of funding it. While Da Vinci didn't lose money, it wasn't enough for them to feel secure enough to set up shop. They also decided to shelve Tink, at least for now. It was such a big project for such a small team, and they definitely couldn't afford the cost of developing it. In August, at GDC Europe, they had a meeting with Carsten Fischerman, the CEO of games publisher Daedalic Entertainment, who they had initially met at the German Developer Awards in 2009. When they were discussing various game and technology ideas, he wasn't very interested. That was until Johannes Ross showed him rough footage of their prototype, Tink. He gathered his team and excitedly told them that this was the project that they should focus on. He even recommended that they take it to Sony and Nintendo. They decided to bring the prototype to Gamescom, which was taking place at about the same time, and they received a lot of positive responses. Shortly afterwards, they incorporated the feedback that they received from Gamescom into a more polished prototype. Then they submitted it to Sony as a part of the application to become developers for the PlayStation 3, an application that was quickly accepted. In order to fund initial development, they were going to apply for a grant from FFF Bayern, a funding program for media in Germany, but in order to fund Tink, they would need to be granted the maximum amount available. With help from Reality Twist, they submitted their application. and in November, they received a grant of 80,000 euros to develop the prototype. The year ended on a high note when, in December, Ting took home the Game Connection Best Project Award, an award for unsigned games. At around the same time, they began taking on contract work, agreeing to develop an iOS app for Ravensburger. With initial funding for Tink in hand and a contract job secured, they decided to pull the trigger. They incorporated as a UG, a special limited liability company, on January 13, 2012, and decided to go full-time for a year and see where things went. If they weren't able to get Tink fully funded, they'd close up shop, since they didn't want to be stuck doing contract work forever. Several years later, in an interview with GamesIndustry.biz, Mimime's managing director, Johannes Roth, described their thoughts at the time. It was really important for us to not get into this cycle of game design students founding a new company. They have a cool idea, but they can't work on it because they don't have enough money, or publishers see that investment as just too risky. We had this deadline. We'll invest 1 year of our lives to get there, and if it doesn't work out, we'll close the company, or at least choose another path. They started pitching the project to publishers across Germany, but they didn't have any luck. But some of these rejections ended up being useful, and they were able to take the feedback that they received and use it to improve the game. For example, several people told them that the game didn't have enough combat to sell well in the United States. This resulted in the creation of the game's combat system, which wasn't something that they had focused on before. They tried raising money however they could, but it never worked out, whether it was talking to publishers in the US or crowdfunding. Then, suddenly, they got a break. In August, at that year's Gamescom, they were contacted by Unity Games, a new, unannounced publishing division at Unity Technologies. Even though Tink was being developed in Unity, they had no idea that this division existed. This was even more surprising to them because all of their previous attempts to contact Unity had gone unanswered. Shortly afterwards, Johannes Roth received an invitation to join a Skype call. For whatever reason, he didn't look into the person that he was speaking with, assuming that it was just another sales call, so he pitched the game to the guy he was speaking to the same way that he always did. After the call, he received word from Unity Games that things were moving along, and that they would need to sign an NDA. He would later find out that the person he spoke to was Tony Garcia, one of the founders of Microsoft Game Studios and the Chief Revenue Officer of Unity Technologies. Things moved quickly after that, at least at first. At Unite 2012, which took place just a few days after Gamescom, they began contract negotiations. But due to various circumstances, the deal wasn't finalized for another 3 months. However, once it was complete, they were set to receive much more than they expected, twice as much as what was being discussed with some other publishers, meaning that they would be able to make a better game than they thought. That being said, it still wasn't a lot of money for a project of this size, but they would make do. This would be their first big project as full-time developers, and also served as an important point in the development of the studio. It served as a bridge from developing primarily mobile games to PC and console games. While they were working on the game, they also took on more contract work to help keep the lights on, developing another mobile game for Ravensburger. While they had always called their project Tink, they weren't exactly concerned with trademarks back when they were still in school. They were never planning to actually release the game anyway. But the end result was that they would have to change the name of the game from Tink to The Last Tinker: City of Colors. After several months of development, it was completed on time in November 2013, but the game wouldn't be released right away. And 2014 was shaping up to be a difficult year for the now 10-person studio. On top of having expensive international events to travel to, they didn't have funding for the full year. Things were tight, but they had a few months worth of savings to fall back on. In order to secure the studio's finances, they started taking on smaller projects. One of those projects was Oops, Noah is Gone, a mobile game tie-in to an animated movie with the same name. Although they received funding from FFF Bayern in 2012 to develop a prototype, the game wasn't released until March 11, 2015, presumably to coincide with the release of the film, which premiered in February and started making its way around the world that spring. On March 11, 2014, Mimimi Productions released an announcement trailer for The Last Tinker that revealed that it was coming to PC and consoles that summer. The next month, Unity Games released a trailer. At the end, it was revealed that the game would be released on Linux, Mac, and Windows PCs on May 12th. Mimimi Productions also received another grant from FFF Bayern that April. It was for the development of a DaVinci prototype for the Xbox One and Wii U. While it would never come to those two platforms, they decided to work on a definitive version of the game for Android and iOS devices. The Last Tinker was released, on time, for PC platforms on May 12, 2014. Things started off on the wrong foot, even if the developers at Mimimi didn't know it yet. About 2 weeks before it launched, the game's publisher, Unity Games, was shut down, and they didn't find out about the closure until 2 weeks after the game was released. The game also received mixed reviews from critics, but players appeared to be a bit more positive. The problem was that there weren't very many players, and the game only made a fraction of what even their most conservative estimates projected at launch. However, even though they were going to be making significantly less than they expected, the studio wasn't in immediate danger. When they were budgeting for the year, they actually didn't take the projected sales of The Last Tinker into account. If they had been relying on that money, Mimimi would have had to shut down. Fortunately, they had the contract to develop Oops, Noah is Gone, which helped them get through this rough patch. Throughout the rest of the year, they finished up work on some of their existing projects. The upgraded version of DaVinci was called DaVinci Deluxe, and it was released on the App Store on July 17th and the Google Play Store on September 16th. And The Last Tinker made its way onto the PlayStation Store on August 19th. All the while, behind the scenes, Mimimi was working on their next project and pitching the idea to publishers, because despite the last Tinker's issues, many people were impressed by the efforts of this small studio. Being able to deliver such an ambitious project, on time and on budget, was impressive. According to Johannes Roth, financially speaking, it was a disaster at that moment, but it was our first 3D action adventure. That's not an easy genre for your first 3D game, and we did well. That opened the door for us to talk to publishers about our next project, because they appreciated what we had achieved with The Last Tinker. Right after finishing the Gold Master for The Last Tinker, Mimimi Productions started working on their next project. They decided to go in a completely different direction and look back to an idea from their days in school, a real-time tactics game with ninjas, or as they pitch it to publishers, Commandos with Ninjas. The original pitch was for a real-time tactics game that you'd play on a tablet. While developing mobile games was something that they had a lot more experience and success with, it wasn't ideal. While it would be an easier game to fund, Dominic Abay, the studio's creative director, wasn't a big fan of the mobile market at the time. Ideally, they'd be able to build a game for the PC and consoles, but they were already having trouble striking a deal. They couldn't get any traction initially because publishers were waiting for reviews of The Last Tinker to come out, but even afterwards, they still had issues. Publishers were wondering why they were pitching something so different from what they've done in the past, and many viewed it as a risky investment. Their pitch was also hindered by their lack of additional funds, since they couldn't afford to make a good vertical slice and were relying on prototypes. But after more than half a year of pitching the project, they finally found a publisher who was willing to take a chance on them. Daedalic Entertainment. They had recently been acquired by Bastei Lübbe, a German publishing company, and had some extra funds available. Carsten Fichelman, who remained at the company after the acquisition, expressed his confidence in the team, and on November 25, 2014, a press release announced that Daedalic Entertainment would be publishing a real-time tactics game by Mimimi Productions for PC and console platforms in 2016. Just like that, the developers at Mimimi Productions were given the chance to work on their dream project, and development on it would begin the next month. While in pre-production, they decided to analyze the history and evolution of the real-time tactics genre. The goal of this exercise was to see if there was anything that games of the past did that would still feel novel if they were released today. In their evaluation, real-time tactics peaked with the first two Commandos games and Desperados Wanted Dead or Alive, before going downhill. Commandos 3 Destination Berlin focused too much on cinematics and over-the-top scripted events. Desperados 2 Cooper's Revenge decided to add first-person shooter mechanics, and what they viewed as a killing blow to the genre was Commando Strike Force, which was just a first-person shooter. They concluded that the genre didn't die because no one wanted to play these kinds of games anymore, but that people stopped making the kinds of games that those players wanted to play. And going forward, they knew that their game needed to be more like the earlier entries in the genre. They often compared the first entry in the Commando series, Commandos Behind Enemy Lines, and its sequel, Commandos 2 Men of Courage. Obviously, the games are going to be fairly similar to one another. They're both stealth-based, real-time tactics games set in World War II, but there are some key differences between them. They viewed Behind Enemy Lines more like a chess game. Sure, there was a diverse cast of characters, but each character had a specific role to play in your strategy. It was restrictive in the sense that you had to play within these character constraints, but that forced the player to use all of their pieces in creative ways in order to get the outcome that they wanted. Like chess, the individual moves may have been simple, but when stacked on top of one another, the possibilities are endless. Men of Courage opened things up a bit. They eliminated rigid character roles by allowing characters to switch weapons and pick up equipment from fallen enemies, and this added a lot of depth and complexity to the game, and it received an even warmer reception from critics and fans. That being the case, you may have expected Mimimi to base their upcoming project on the much-lauded sequel, but they didn't. In a postmortem for GameDeveloper.com, Dominic Abay described the studio's view on the two games, and how this exercise helped them to establish the core pillar of their project's design. For us, Commandos 2 watered down some of the series' uniqueness established with its first entry, advancing it from a chess-like game to a more realistic simulation. More complexity had been added. For example, by putting way more actions at the player's disposal, they eventually made the game harder to grasp. This was not the way we wanted to create more depth in gameplay. In consequence, we defined our design pillar, creating depth without adding complexity, which we aim to uphold for all aspects of our game design. The realistic approach taken in Commandos 2 also made player characters a bit too powerful, eventually harming the unique team play aspect, created before by restricting realism in favor of gameplay balance. One of the first things that they did when coming up with ideas for their next project was to determine and then focus on their target audience, something that they struggled with when developing The Last Tinker. They were targeting fans of the real-time tactics genre, fans of Commandos and Desperados. They weren't trying to reinvent the wheel, but to refine the experience as best they could. Their plan was to make the game fairly challenging, even on the default difficulty setting. The challenge was actually determining what was and what wasn't difficult in any given level. Sometimes players struggled when they thought it would be easy, and breezed through what was supposed to be a difficult section. They balanced the game through iteration, building something, testing it, and then adjusting it until it felt right. Even when making this game was just a dream, and he was just a fan of Commandos and Desperados, Dominic Abay always thought that the settings for those games felt a little weird. In an interview with the Super BS Gamescast, Moritz Wagner, the studio's lead designer, described his feelings on the issue.
And all of the games that have been there previously do not really feel like stealth games from their setting, right? I mean, you have World War II, which it makes sense that you have commandos sneaking behind enemy lines, but the World War is not something you think of if you think of stealth. And Desperados is a series about Western cowboys. I mean, this is about shooting, right? Nobody thinks of stealthy cowboys.
Unlike soldiers and cowboys, ninjas just seemed like the perfect fit for this type of game. Initially, while they were planning to use ninjas as their primary characters, they were building a world that skewed more towards historical fantasy. However, at some point, they decided to lean more into the historical setting. They decided to be as historically accurate as they could be, while still introducing their own characters and stories. After doing more research on the history of Japan, and ninjas more broadly, they decided to set their game in the Edo period. Tennis Husak, the communications director, explained their decision. When you're making a Commandos type game, it's important to have a certain degree of realism. So if we want ninjas in a realistic setting, we had to stick to a certain time frame. We chose the Edo period over the Warring States period because we wanted missions to take place not just in military camps and castle sieges, but also in more civil settings like quiet villages and bustling cities. Another important thing was that we wanted to have blades and guns in the game. After some, or maybe a lot of research, we found out that the Edo period was simply perfect. In the beginning, they thought about using a cute, cartoon-like art style that they thought would look great on mobile devices, but as things progressed, they decided to make the art style more realistic, both to reflect the more mature tone of the game and to stay more in line with the look of Commandos and Desperados. That being said, they didn't want the game to look too realistic. There were three primary reasons for this. The first was that they didn't want to be limited creatively. The second reason was more practical. They just didn't have very many artists. While the team had grown since the last Tinker, there were still only 15 people working on the project. The last reason was that they wanted to create a distinct art style that would be easily recognizable, which was something that they thought would be easier to do if the art was stylized. In a piece for i4Games, Bianca Dor, the lead artist, said, "To create a unique and outstanding art style, we mix realistic and non-realistic elements, like outlines and vibrant colors. First of all, from an artistic point of view, we needed to understand Asian culture and the way of designing things like buildings and clothing, and even how people lived and behaved. So we did a lot of research by studying photos of Japan, old ink paintings, and books about Asian architecture and their way of living. We even had a book about rice farming that we read. While it was great that they had a firm setting to work with, it created its own set of challenges. They wanted to make the player feel like they were actually in Japan during the Edo period. To do this, they wanted to build assets based on what actually existed back then. But no one on the team was an expert on Japanese history, and visual references weren't readily available. So, in addition to the research that they were conducting, they consulted a Japanologist from a nearby university. He not only reviewed their work for accuracy, but provided them with additional reference materials. In the end, they decided to make the environments mostly realistic with a dash of fantasy, but made concessions for gameplay purposes. According to Bianca Dor, for example, Asian village houses have very steep roofs, so you can't climb or walk on them. But we had our vertical gameplay where you climb on roofs to avoid the enemy's views or kill them from above, and didn't want to lose this for village levels. So we added some kind of roof terrace around the roof that are walkable. But in reality, these houses had no terraces. There were also some elements that were exaggerated for the sake of visual clarity. One example is the size of characters' headdresses, which were used to signify a character's importance. Other times, they had to come up with artistic solutions to issues caused elsewhere. For example, all the characters have very long legs and are less detailed below their hips. This is because of the perspective from which the player views the game. It makes the character models look off, and causes this lack of detail on their lower bodies. They had to keep the player's perspective in mind throughout the design process. We had to include the perspective in the way we design things. Since you see most of the assets from above, you must make the top side of the assets more interesting than the rest. Japanese buildings are often richly decorated under the roof with some kind of pillars. Due to our perspective, you don't see much of it because the roof covers this up, so we could just leave those details out, which saved many polys. Their choice of colors also had to be carefully considered. They decided to use colors that were more bright and saturated in order to ensure that there was enough contrast between the characters and the environment. They also used colors to highlight points of interest, distinguish between different types of enemies, and highlight special areas. In line with their pre-production assessments, they wanted all the game's characters to play a specific role within the team. However, they didn't want any of the characters to be useless on their own. According to Dominica Bay, we focused again on a limited, distinct feature set per character with no transfer options, and designed them in a way that every character's skill was strong in combination with skills of other teammates, but also quite effective on its own. In order to do this, they decided to give everyone the same basic tools, but tuned each character individually in order to make them distinct from one another. Each character was given the ability to incapacitate enemies, a special skill, a distraction, a gun, and a health pack. While each character would have their own special skill and distraction, there were also mechanical adjustments made to suit each character, the tuning mentioned earlier. One example is each character's proficiency in incapacitating enemies. Some characters can dispatch multiple foes quickly, while others can struggle to take out just one. Another example is the physical traits of each character. More agile characters can climb up various objects and move faster when unimpeded, and stronger characters could lift and throw heavier objects and move faster while carrying things. The first character to make their way onto a piece of paper was Aiko's geisha form. They decided to give her a lot of hair and had it curl around her in a way that wasn't exactly realistic, but it was unique. and it served as a template for their design going forward. Creating Hayato, a fairly typical ninja character, appears to have been pretty straightforward. In the beginning, Yuki was actually going to be Hayato's younger brother, but that idea was eventually scrapped. This was because they would have had 2 standard ninja characters and a cast that was composed of 4 men and 1 woman. They wanted to have a more interesting and diverse cast of characters. By changing Yuki from Hayato's younger brother into a girl who's down on her luck and fending for herself, they were able to accomplish both of their objectives. The next 2 characters gave the team a bit of trouble. The previous 3, aside from their distractions and special moves, were very similar mechanically. They wanted to create a character that didn't seem to fit within a stealth-based game, and decided to create a large samurai character, Mugen. It was important to nail Mugen's gameplay, so that they could keep this unique, tank-like character in the game for the sake of variety. According to Bianca Dor, it was a gamble, but luckily Mugen's gameplay worked out as intended, and we were able to keep his design as a big, strong samurai, instead of just a slightly stronger and more armored version of Hayato. From the very beginning, they wanted to have one character who was completely different from the others, and this character turned into Takuma. They decided to make him significantly less mobile than the rest of the cast. The nature of the injury itself shifted over time. In the beginning, he was going to get around using a wheelchair, but they decided that it would be too restrictive. This was because he wouldn't be able to traverse rough terrain or climb steps. They toyed with the idea of having Mugen carry him past troublesome spots, but in the end, they decided to give him a peg leg. Another thing that complicated Takuma's design was his distraction. Kuma, an animal companion that does tricks to distract enemies. They had several ideas for what type of animal Kuma should be, including a wolf, monkey, owl, and others, but they decided to go with the Tanuki. The game was always going to be character focused. They wanted to build a strong core team, but this created issues. One of those was the game's story, which they struggled with, but the plot would take a back seat, and the characters and gameplay would be what pulled players forward. The other issue is one that they don't think they ended up solving: the game's villains. Because so much of their time and attention was paid to the main cast, they didn't focus on the antagonists as much as they could have. While you get to see the main cast interact and form relationships, the villains are all fairly distant. They exist kind of because they have to, tied to the plot of the game more than the main characters. These struggles weren't helped by the fact that some of the villains had to be changed or entirely removed before the game was released. From a gameplay perspective, like mentioned earlier, Mimimi wasn't trying to reinvent the wheel. They thought that, fundamentally, the core gameplay of older real-time tactics games was fun. The goal was to keep the core loop intact, while refining elements that would feel off in a more contemporary game. According to Johannes Roth, internally, we agreed that we weren't going to add any forced innovation to the genre. We just wanted to make the very best version, in terms of usability and user experience, of those real-time tactics games. One feature that they knew would be vital to the experience, but were also worried about including, was a quick save and quick load system. It was developed by Dominica Bay, and it didn't function like a traditional save load system. Some games save parts of a level and load the rest of it normally, as if you were entering it for the first time. But, because of the nature of the game, they would have to save the entire level. While it was a core part of the real-time tactics experience, being a key feature in the original Commandos, they weren't sure how modern audiences and reviewers would take to it. In order to combat the risk that players would find the gameplay tedious, while still keeping the system, they tried to come up with ways to reduce its importance. And to do that, they wanted to give players more ways to avoid being detected in the first place. That leads us to the game's detection system. Like in older titles, players could navigate their way through levels by avoiding an enemy's line of sight. This information is represented by their view cone. Just like in Commandos, they decided to only allow the player to see one view cone at a time. One reason for this was to make the game more readable, as having multiple view cones on the screen at once could be overwhelming. It was also a way to obscure information. Since there is no hidden information in the game, having access to only one view cone forces players to memorize patterns in order to make their way through levels undetected. Their view cone would also be able to convey meaningful information to the player by using colors and simple patterns. For example, if an area is highlighted dark green, the player can move through that area undetected as long as they're crouching, but you'll almost immediately be detected in a bright green area, regardless of whether you're crouching or not. The thing that gave them the most trouble was the detection mechanic itself. When you're about to be spotted, there are a series of things that let a player know. First, you'll hear a special sound,
I'm going in,
and the enemy's view cone will focus on the character. Then, the green area within the view cone will start turning yellow, filling in towards the character. And if the character makes contact with any part of the yellow view cone that's been filled in, they'll be detected, which is a feature that fans of Desperados would probably recognize. But they wanted to add something else, something to stop players from just quick loading once they were spotted. They tried a few different things. First, they tried implementing a sort of time freeze mechanic. Once the yellow area came in contact with the player, the game would freeze, allowing the player to perform an additional action. They also experimented with a feature that would allow players to rewind time. Unfortunately, neither of these ideas worked as well as they thought they would. After going back to the drawing board, They eventually landed on a solution. Moritz Wagner described the breakthrough in an article for Gamasutra. After looking at it from a new angle, our creative director Dominic Abe suggested a simple slow motion that begins when you enter a view cone and starts filling it up with yellow. Again, there were some problems. Still, we decided to stick with slow motion, since these problems were definitely something that could be fixed. It also seemed like the most simple and elegant solution we had come up with so far. Plus, budget was another factor. At some point, you just have to settle for something. As for why the game's budget became a factor for consideration, is because they ended up working on this feature for about a year, and in a post-mortem at GDC 2018, Moritz Wagner called it the biggest story of design failure we have in the game. As mentioned previously, they wanted to emphasize teamwork and coordination between the game's characters. In the beginning, they tried to do this by creating team-based skills, similar to what was done in some Desperados games, but they thought that this added an unnecessary level of complexity. They had a couple of ideas for some character-specific interactions, like Mugen helping characters to reach specific locations, for example, but they couldn't come up with enough to actually put them in the game. After they moved on from that idea, they decided to make their own take on another feature from Desperados. Planning mode. Like its predecessor, this shadow mode would allow players to select an action for each character that they would perform when you sent the command. This allowed them to accomplish two things at once. It reinforced the sense of teamwork that they were trying to implement without adding additional complexity, since you'd be using skills and techniques that you were already familiar with. And it was an important feature for playing the game on a controller. It was simple for someone using a keyboard and mouse to send a character somewhere and switch to another character while they were moving. But when using a controller, you'd be manually moving each character, and Shadow Mode helped to provide them with additional flexibility. While they were developing Shadow Mode, they experimented with allowing characters to take more than one action, but when they were testing, players would use it to clear entire sections of the level. Problem was that this wasn't how they wanted players to approach the game. Their goal wasn't to create a game that was based solely on planning, but executing in real time. If you were able to do an unlimited number of actions in Shadow Mode, it would eliminate the need for execution. In an interview with Game Reactor, Dominic Abe described the balance that they were trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of tactic games are missing, I think. That it, like, once you have your tactic, then it just works and you watch it, but now, like, here you have to be, like, really fast and precise. So it's not numbers that tell your fate, it's like you, and you have to be good.
In order to produce the game's audio, Mimimi teamed up with 3 freelancers. The game's music was composed by Filippo Beck-Bocose, mixing and mastering was done by Guido Hieronymus, and Philip Seye was the game's Foley artist. Because each level in the game would take a while to complete, Filippo decided to develop the game's soundtrack by using 2 types of music, linear music and dynamic music. Each level would feature a unique, linear loop, similar to classic games from the 80s and 90s, and they would build upon these loops with what they called stealth tracks, which are songs composed of up to 15 layers of instruments that changed based on what's happening on the screen. Filippo Beck-Bocose described this dynamic layer of music in The Art of Shadow Tactics: Blades of the Shogun. So if we need a push in intensity at a certain moment, the game can musically shift into a higher gear by adding percussion, strings, electronic elements, and whatnot, all while keeping track of the musical timing. In essence, the game engine knows when the correct musical beats are playing and can trigger changes based on this information, making transitions smooth and musical. This was all implemented by working closely with the developers. In order to make this process easier, the music was made entirely within Unity, the engine being used to develop the game instead of middleware. In order to bring an additional layer of authenticity to the game's music, they worked directly with a couple of Japanese musicians, Kari Nakagawa, who played the koto, and Kazuyo Kuriya, who played the flute. Kari Nakagawa also provided valuable feedback to Filippo when he was composing the score. In an interview with Behind the Audio, he described these interactions.
So yeah, we would go over them and she would look at the score and say, okay, this is great, or well, actually, can you change it? This is impossible to play, you know. And
in addition to the linear and dynamic music, they decided to add character-specific motifs. These would play whenever certain actions were taking place, like killing an enemy or hiding in the bushes. In order to differentiate each motif, they decided to assign a specific instrument to each character. Hayato's motif used the shamisen, Aiko's the koto, Yuki's the shakuhachi, Mukun was given the drums, and Takuma was assigned the akobue. The game would feature both English and Japanese voice acting. The English voices were handled by OM UK and recorded in London. The Japanese audio was handled by Active Gaming Media, a Japanese localization company, and recorded in Osaka. In order to make translating the game as easy as possible, they actually wrote the game entirely in English. Given the 13 languages that it would eventually support, and the difficulty of properly translating German, this approach made the most sense. Despite featuring a ninja and a samurai, you wouldn't see either of those words in the title of this project. Mimimi wanted to be ambitious. They wanted to leave the door open for future real-time tactics games in alternative settings. So they decided to name this potential series of games Shadow Tactics, and use a subtitle to inform the players of the setting. According to Dominic Abe, truth is, we and Daedalic wanted to think big, and create an IP that allows for more than one setting. This is something very common nowadays in large productions, example, Assassin's Creed, Total War, etc. For a smaller studio, this is a bit more risky, because it often means your game title is more generic. But we love the idea of exploring different settings, and now we have an IP that lets us do that. So if we ever get the chance to make Shadow Tactics Legions of Rome, That's one less thing to worry about. Throughout 2015, Mimimi Productions worked on reaching the project's alpha milestone. They were also working on a vertical slice. The goal was to have one level of the game as polished as possible in order to serve as a reference point for the rest of the game. This vertical slice would end up being mission number 5. Also, at the beginning of 2015, they released another contracted mobile title, Janosh: The Trip to Panama. In December, 1 year into the game's development, they realized something. The vertical slice looked much better than they originally thought it could. While it was great that they had grown so much in the past year, in order to get the rest of the game to look that good, it would take a lot of time. After seeing the difference, they couldn't go back to the originally pitched look, but as time passed, they realized that they didn't have enough time to finish the game in the way that they wanted. And it wasn't just the visuals, they also wanted more time to improve the levels. This wasn't something that they had planned for, so they had another important decision to make. They had about 3 months worth of savings to cover gaps in funding, and after everyone in the studio agreed, they decided to go all in once again. Here's Johannes Roth's description of the situation.
We chose to invest that slack, that buffer money into Shadow Tactics because we saw, well, we invested those 18 months and we know exactly what we have to do in the next 3 months to really get it to another level of quality. We also knew that if we released this game in a bad way, because it was all about the kind of the revival of the real-time tactics genre, that we would fail because you only have that one chance.
They also spoke with Daedalic Entertainment, who allowed them to cancel all of their previously planned DLC levels in order to give them an additional month to polish the game, and after around 21 months of development, Shadow Tactics Blades of the Shogun was complete. All they had to do now was release the game, and make sure people knew it existed. One thing they realized when bringing the game to different trade shows was that most players, even those that were initially skeptical, really enjoyed the game after they played it. This inspired Dennis Huzak to ask the team to produce a demo. While they were initially skeptical, worrying about the demo potentially damaging their sales, he managed to convince them, and once it was complete, they decided to lean into it. They made the free demo a key part of their marketing, and it worked. The demo was released on November 21st, 2016, and within 2 weeks, the game went from being listed on 15,000 wish list to 40,000, and those first 15,000 were accumulated over 7 months. The game was released on PC platforms on December 6, 2016, and the response blew the team away. They were confident that the game was good, but they weren't sure how it was going to be received. It was given near universal acclaim, receiving a score of 85 on review aggregator Metacritic, and 98% of its reviews on Steam were positive as well. And it didn't just review well. Shadow Tactics Blades of the Shogun sold more than 60,000 copies during its launch month, which was 2 times more than the studio's most optimistic sales estimates. However, even with the game's warm reception and positive early sales numbers, the studio was in trouble. As expected, those extra 4 months of development time consumed all of their savings. That wouldn't have been a death sentence for the studio if they had been able to secure additional work, but all of their plans fell through. According to Johannes Roth, when we realized that our backup plans for new projects didn't work out as planned, we knew we were screwed. Because we exclusively focused on Shadow Tactics, we didn't invest in any new pitches and had nearly nothing to offer to new partners. On top of that, they understandably waited for the release in the first few weeks of Steam Spy data before they wanted to sign a project. This put everyone at Mimimi Productions in a tough spot. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and they were in the process of finalizing paperwork that would end the employment of a large portion of the team. On December 7th, 1 day after the game was released, the team had mixed emotions as they attended that year's German Developer Awards. The team cleaned up, taking home awards for Best German Game, Best PC Console Game, Best Game Design, and Best Studio. While they were happy that they were doing well at the award show, they also knew that the studio might not survive into the new year. But they hadn't given up, and things were still going on in the background. They were already in contact with THQ Nordic, who operated as Nordic Games until recently, in order to work with one of the many licenses that they had acquired over the years. And, fortunately for Mimimi, they had just released a critically acclaimed game. That opened some publishers' doors, and made them uniquely qualified for a special project. THQ Nordic had acquired the rights to Desperados in 2013, and Mimimi was trying to work out a deal for them to work on the next installment. Here's how Johannes Roth described the situation. They were interested, but it wasn't really going anywhere. We won a lot of awards, but we knew the company was basically closing down. Then I met a guy from THQ Nordic there, and we talked for hours about what we could do. Would it be possible to sign Desperados 3 really quickly and save the studio? And they followed through with it. On December 23rd, Johannes Roth sent an email to everyone at the studio. This email informed them that a contract had been signed, and the studio had been saved. At the beginning of 2017, the company was working on 2 things. Half of the team was working on console ports for Shadow Tactics, and the other half was assigned to Desperados 3, known internally as Codename Kartoffel or Codename Potato. Initially, they were developing both versions of Shadow Tactics, and planned to release them at the same time. However, at some point in development, they decided to focus on the PC version, and release the game on consoles at a later date. The 2 big problems that they ran into when porting the game were controls and performance. They wanted to design the controls so that they worked the way that most other console games do, in accordance with what they called console conventions. But in the end, this wasn't viable. As Dominic Abe explained, This was not really possible though, because some systems like freely moving, rotating and zooming a camera are rare on consoles, and there's no controller standard for them. Also, we didn't explicitly playtest the game with console-only players. All in all, nothing really horrible went wrong here, and the console audience was very forgiving because it was something new, and there were no obvious comparisons to other games that solved these issues in profoundly better ways. But we still think that there are many ways for further fine-tuning, especially considering controls. When they began working on the port, the performance on both PS4 and Xbox One was awful. While a mid-range PC would bottom out at 30 frames per second or FPS, with relatively fast quick save and load times, the console versions would run at 15 FPS on some levels, and could take 10 seconds to quick save and nearly a minute to load. The goal was for the ports to be able to run the game at 1080p at a stable 30 FPS, while matching the PC's high settings and fixing the quick save system. They implemented various changes in order to optimize the game, and were able to drastically improve performance. Work on the ports began after the game launched on Steam the previous year, and it took them about 3 months to complete. The game launched on PS4 and Xbox One in Europe on July 28th, and it arrived in North America on August 1st. Shadow Tactics continued to perform well in 2017, and 1 year after its release on Steam, it had sold over 400,000 copies on PC alone. Eventually, people started asking them what was coming next. Throughout the year, when asked if they were working on a sequel, they would respond with something like this.
So, are you going to do Shadow Tactics 2?
Hopefully. Right now we're not doing it, but we're doing something similar in the genre. So, yeah, we can't tell.
While they couldn't announce anything, with the console ports complete, the entire team would be able to focus on Desperados 3, and in December 2017, Mimimi Productions rebranded. From this point forward, they would be known as Mimimi Games. Desperados 3 was going to build upon the foundations established by 2 other games. The game had serving as a prequel for Desperados Wanted Dead or Alive, and the most highly regarded real-time tactics game in recent memory, Shadow Tactics Blades of the Shogun. The games would, inevitably, be very similar to one another. They would share everything from mechanics to the game engine. Since Desperados 3 was also being developed in Unity, they were able to utilize all of the tools that they had already built, and add new ones when necessary. That being said, the goal wasn't just to remake Shadow Tactics with a Western skin. They wanted to take everything that Shadow Tactics did and make it bigger and better. And unlike Shadow Tactics, this time around they would be shooting for a more realistic art style. But why did they decide to make Desperados 3 a prequel? In an interview with VentureBeat, Jonathan Reidler, a producer at THQ Nordic, described their reasoning. We looked at the story that happened in the second game, as well as a spin-off game that was called Hell Dorado. You could look at that as Desperados 2.5. We decided that the story that we wanted to tell should be a fresh start relative to those. It's not just a prequel, but also kind of a reboot. We're taking some liberties with developing the characters. One of the areas they decided to focus on was the game's animations. In order to improve on what they'd done previously, they decided to utilize motion capture or mocap technology for the first time. In order to accomplish this, they partnered with Take One, a motion capture studio in Belgrade, Serbia. One of the challenges that they had to deal with was the camera angle. Unlike in film, the game would only be viewed from one camera angle. Because of this, they had to capture the entire scene in one shot. Another thing that was going to differentiate this game from Shadow Tactics was the role of guns. Moritz Wagner described the new role that guns would play in a THQ Nordic dev blog.
And the other thing that is new and I like a lot is the gun gameplay, actually. Because in our previous game, Shadow Tactics, guns were just a small part because you were playing ninjas. They were not needed. But in a Western game, you need guns and you need sort of shootouts. But what we didn't want to have was action sequences. We found a way, I think, to make the guns strong and to allow you to sometimes engage in a gunfight, but not do it all the time. And you always have to stealth in between.
As 2018 rolled around, specifics about Mimimi's latest project were still shrouded in mystery. That was until August 21st, 2018, when Desperados 3 was revealed at Gamescom. While it was initially scheduled to be released in the summer of 2019, the game was pushed to 2020. Despite having to finish the game during the pandemic, while not ideal, they didn't think that the work-from-home environment slowed down production. Dominic Bay stated that home office doesn't make our work any easier, but we don't lose our effectiveness, even if the social aspect of the team suffers in places. As far as I know, our employees try to keep in touch with each other as much as they can. I think we manage this well compared to other companies. On June 16, 2020, after 3 years of development, Desperados 3 was released on PC, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. Just like Shadow Tactics before it, the game was a critical success. It was widely regarded as one of the best games of the year, and nominated for Best Strategy Game by several publications and the Game Awards. Fans would have more to do after they finished the main game. Mimimi Games would release 3 additional levels as DLC, Money for the Vultures Parts 1 through 3, with the first one arriving on digital storefronts on September 2nd, and the final one on November 3rd. On December 1st, 2020, Matthias Krot, the communications lead at Mimimi Games, released a blog post entitled The Future of Mimimi Games. There were 3 main points of discussion: their next major project, self-publishing, and future funding. Their next project was, unsurprisingly, going to be another real-time tactics game, and it was currently known as Codenames Süßkartoffel, or Sweet Potato. Like with their previous projects, they had already started talking with publishers. While things were progressing well, they realized that they had a unique opportunity. According to Johannes Roth, We know how to make these games, and we also know how to make the game our own. Shadow Tactics was Commandos meets Ninjas. Desperados was an IP that existed from back then. These games stay close to the history of the genre. We know what we can change. Sub-publishing would grant the studio full control over development and publishing, from both a creative and business perspective. This would allow them to create, quote, a game that is 100% made by Mimimi Games. The last point they covered was funding. The now 30-person studio is going to be relying on two key entities for funding, a currently anonymous investor and the German government. More details about the investor would be revealed at a later date. The government funding would come in the form of a recently approved grant ran by the Federal Ministry of Transport and Digital Infrastructure, now known as the Federal Ministry for Digital and Transport. As long as you met the requirements, German developers could qualify for a grant that covered up to 50% of the game's development cost, but the covered amount would decrease for higher budget productions. On February 4, 2021, Mimimi released another blog post with additional details about Codename Süß Kartoffel. The first announcement was that this new project wasn't going to be Shadow Tactics 2, Desperados 4, or a new Commandos game, but an original IP. The next announcement revealed their previously unknown investor, Kowloon Knights. Here's how they described their relationship. Kowloon Knights is not a publisher, and we're still doing the self-publishing thing. Kowloon Knights is a team of business professionals and seasoned studio heads that invest in game projects without claiming any shares of the company or IP rights to the game. Also, there was one small detail that they included in the description of their new game. Instead of calling it a real-time tactics game, they started to refer to the genre as stealth strategy, despite all the conversation around Codename Süß Kartoffel. That wasn't their main focus at the time. The next month, on March 25th, Mimimi Games announced Shadow Tactics Blades of the Shogun, Aiko's Choice. Aiko's Choice was a standalone expansion to Blades of the Shogun, and it was going to be released near the end of 2021. Unfortunately for fans on the console and Mac, the expansion would only be released on PC platforms. This was because, in order to release the game on console, they would have to update the Unity engine, and to release it on Mac, they would have had to update that version of the game to Mac 64-bit. Since they're primarily a single project studio, these would have taken far too much time to complete. But why did they decide to release an expansion to Shadow Tactics? And why now? Well, it looks like everything just happened to fall into place. There was the new German developer grant for one. They also had some empty space in the production schedule that they needed to fill. And people were always asking for more Shadow Tactics content, so they knew that demand for the game was there. In fact, Shadow Tactics sold more copies in 2020 than in 2019, and they don't attribute that increase in sales to the pandemic, but an increased interest in the genre and their games because of Desperados 3. Shadow Tactics Blades of the Shogun Aiko's Choice was released on December 6, 2021, and, like its predecessors, was a critical success, receiving a score of 83 on Metacritic. After they finished working on Aiko's Choice and shifted their focus to Codename Süß Kartoffel, they decided that they wanted to do things differently. One of the biggest deviations from their previous entries was a commitment to avoiding realistic settings. This was a rule that they established from the concept phase. In an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun, Dominic Abay explained the need for this change. One thing we wanted for sure was that we had something that's not grounded in a realistic setting. That was a requirement for all the pitches we did internally, and that's because we wanted to improve on the gameplay. We were restricted by realism, so that was a core pillar. It had to be something fantasy or sci-fi or something non-realistic. While ideas were being tossed around, Martin Hamburger, who would eventually become the game's lead writer, threw out an idea: pirates. It was perfect. Pirate stories could be as crazy and over the top, or as serious and realistic as you wanted them to be. And since they wanted to experiment with magical powers, they decided to make their pirates cursed pirates. The magical abilities that they gave to each character are what ultimately shaped their designs. In a developer diary, Lucas Rainier, a concept artist, explained that most of the crew's visuals are based first and foremost on the character's abilities. The design team first comes up with a fun skill set, while completely disregarding what this character could possibly look like later, and the visuals are crafted to suit these mechanics accordingly. The magical abilities, and what they enabled, were only a part in a much larger shift in game design from their previous titles. With this new project, they wanted to provide the player with as much freedom as possible. They did this in several ways. First, instead of having 5 characters in total and not having any control over when or if they were selected for a mission, you'd be given 8 characters to choose from. Second, they completely overhauled the game's mission structure. Instead of progressing through a series of linear missions, players would be able to travel to different islands whenever they wanted, and each of these islands was its own sandbox with its own set of missions. It wasn't going to be an open world, but a game with what they called a, quote, very open structure, end quote. But this new structure had its own set of challenges. Unlike in a more realistic setting, you had to create original environments. And since you would visit the same locations within the same playthrough, something that you couldn't do in Shadow Tactics or Desperados 3, they were restricted in a different way. While they had the freedom to make each location however they wanted, they couldn't create grand location-altering events like they did before. Here's how Dominic Abay described the challenges of working in this more open structure. Something like Desperados 3's wedding scene. We can't pull that off easily right now. In the beginning, this openness has the drawback that it's a little bit more generic, I would say, with you revisiting these locations. We tried to have ideas that work with the structure of the missions. With this open structure, they also had to completely change the way they presented the game's story. In their previous games, they knew exactly what the characters were going to do and where they were going to be, which made writing dialogue easier. In this game, they'd have to develop a new approach. They decided to start with a simple concept. There would be a main overarching story, and they would tell smaller, standalone stories along the way. To account for the fact that they couldn't control which characters would actually be selected in each mission, they decided to have the main plot revolve around a small number of key characters. They would flesh out the other characters with character-specific missions and optional side content. This was aided by the game's ship, the Red Marley. The Red Marley not only functioned as the game's hub world, a feature that they'd been interested in implementing since The Last Tinker, but is an important character in the game's story. While on the ship, characters could converse with one another. Here's how Martin Hamburger described its importance to the game's world and characters. That greatly helped fleshing out each crew member. Since we couldn't rely too much on mission dialogue this time around, in terms of world building, we did give some characters deeper ties to the history of the Lost Caribbean, so we could sneak bits of lore in there. Since they're undead, they can give accounts on events that lie centuries in the past. That was also a first for us. On December 8, 2022, Elena Schulz, the communications manager, released a blog post entitled, "Real-Time Tactics Needs a New Name, and Here's Why." The post detailed why Mimimi Games had stopped using the phrase real-time tactics to describe its games, and why they thought that stealth strategy was a better genre descriptor. Because there are so few newer games in this genre, it doesn't make most people feel something. That's why we put a lot of thought in finding a new name, and why we firmly believe that stealth strategy does our genre more justice. There is a lot of potential for misunderstandings, because tactics is usually associated with turn-based games. Most journalists would describe the game rather than using the genre name. Reviews talked about a new Commando-like or top-down stealth game, or even referred to Shadow Tactics as a strategy game with stealth. Stealth strategy is not only way easier to understand for a lot of people, but it also carries a lot of memories and emotions for everyone who enjoys those types of games. And the best part is, we don't have to change our games to fit the new name. The next month, on January 24, 2023, Mimimi Games revealed what they had been working on: Shadow Gambit: The Cursed Crew. The latest entry in Mimimi's stealth strategy catalog was released on August 17, 2023 for console and PC platforms. And just like their previous titles, the game was incredibly well received. But less than 2 weeks after launch, while some reviews were still trickling in, Mimimi Games made a surprising announcement. On August 29th, a blog post by Johannes Roth announced that Shadow Gambit: The Cursed Crew would be the final game that the studio would produce. As for why this was happening, Johannes Roth explained that making these games was amazing and extremely taxing at the same time. Reaching the level of quality Mimimi strives for is hard and requires focus and dedication. We also have to acknowledge that our future production costs are growing faster than the potential revenues of our genre. The increased financial pressure and level of risk became unsustainable. Additionally, whenever our games got close to release and were finally fun to play, a new fight for funding of the following project started, making this a continuous cycle. Since 2011 and pitching The Last Tinker, there never was any downtime for either of us. As founders and directors, we found it increasingly difficult to strike a balance between fulfilling internal expectations for the studio and being available for our young families. Meeting our goals of quality, company culture, and management requires a constant level of energy that we simply can't provide anymore. Ramping down the company and making Shadow Gambit our final game is an extremely tough decision. We never expected this would be how Mimimi ends, but if even one of us were to break down, fail, or burn out, the situation would escalate quickly. Ultimately, managing a production on this scale, in combination with an extremely competitive market, proved to be too taxing for us. In light of all the above, we decided to pull the brakes. While they were winding down the studio, they would continue working on Shadow Gambit for the rest of the year, and still had additional content planned. After releasing patches on PC and console, they had another announcement to make. On November 22nd, they announced that they would be releasing 2 DLC expansions on December 6th. Their final project is Mimimi Games. On December 6th, Shadow Gambit fans would be able to download Yuki's Wish, which featured Yuki and Kumo from Shadow Tactics and Zagan's Ritual. In addition to the 2 expansions, there would be a free update, Treasure Hunt, and a complete edition with both expansions, as well as an art book and the game's soundtrack on PC, went on sale. But Mimimi had one more surprise. On December 14th, as a final farewell, they released the Shadow Gambit modding tool for PC platforms, which allowed fans of the game to create custom missions and share them with other players. With that, their work was done. From dorm rooms in Munich to trade show floors, facing bankruptcy, releasing back-to-back-to-back critically acclaimed games, reviving a genre, becoming the face of that genre, and then redefining it. After 15 years, Mimimi Games would close its doors for the final time in December 2023. The types of games that Mimimi made have always been niche, games loved by a small group of players, but seemingly ignored by almost everyone else. Shadow Gambit: The Cursed Crew had ambitions of changing this, of pushing past genre expectations and delivering something that appealed to both longtime fans and those on the outside looking in. But in the end, nothing changed. In an interview with Polygon shortly after the studio's closure, Raditz Wagner expressed his opinion on the genre's commercial viability, and the frustration that came with creating good games for a niche audience. Everybody who played our games loves them. On Metacritic, on Steam, people love it. But a lot of people don't even try it, even if there's a free demo. It's too stealthy, it's too tactical, I can see vision cones and screenshots. Maybe the old school class of stealth games ruined it for some people. You get detected, you fail. Sadly, I wish the modern open-ended kind of stealth was viable regardless, but I just don't think it is. It's like, I want to get that recognition. I want people to see what we're doing and enjoy it. It just doesn't happen for a reason that's completely out of my control. It's just baked into the fact that it's this kind of game, and there's nothing we can do about it. We've been scraping very hard at the ceiling of our genre. genre, and one of the biggest goals with Shadow Gambit was to expand the audience. But we've been working within 2 niches basically. There's a lot of positivity, a lot of hype in a smaller group, the people who played our games, and that's great to see. I'm grateful for that, but of course you want more. So, where does stealth strategy or real-time tactics go from here? If Mimimi couldn't solve this real-time dilemma, who can? Of course, these aren't questions that we can answer right now, but we do know this. When people were dreaming of a follow-up to Commandos and Desperados, they weren't expecting it to come from the developers of The Last Tinker. So, maybe, the next group of developers that will push the genre forward are already out there.